My name's Simon Willis. I'm from SunGard. Today I'm going to talk around where we are kind of in the last couple of years around cloud services and some predictions for 2012 and beyond, which are kind of where the hover slippers come into play. Oh, there's the clicker. Okay. So state of play. Around kind of the cloud market, are we still confused? Is it still going through that hype cycle? Obviously, you know, the press gets hold of something, loves to go and put it out in the press and say it's the next best thing, and you know, it's a revolution. You know, to me, cloud is more of an evolution. It's just a different way of delivering IT back to the business. However, I've had a couple of comments, you know, when I presented, and you know, funny enough, one of the funniest one I've had is when I actually was sitting on the plane. I was reading, you know, an IT press and had cloud on the front, and you know, there was a guy sitting next to me and said, "Oh, you know, you do this cloud computing?" And I said, "Yeah." So he goes, "What's cloud?" Because to me, it's like, you know, effectively using a laptop on a plane, which I thought was brilliant because it was quite true, because there was clouds literally flying over the clouds. I thought, yeah, fair enough, laptop, clouds, works quite well. But there is still a little bit confusion. Hopefully, you know, when we come to exhibitions and seminars and communities like this, it's hopefully when we start to break through kind of, you know, the FUD which the press like to throw to us and say it's, you know, it's the next best thing. However, there are a number of characteristics around cloud, which I see as pretty much it's delivered as a service. So really you can either back to internally, if you host the cloud service yourself back in your own data center, or through a service provider, you should provide that as a service back to the business. One of the fundamentals around cloud, and really one of the things around obviously the capability of the scalability and the elastic nature of cloud service. So you should in theory just pay for what you use today and be able to scale up and scale down based on demand. Also, multi-tenancy, obviously, to provide you a level of the economics, especially around things like the public cloud services as well. And really, where we all today have, you know, credit cards and electricity bills which come on a monthly basis, that's itemized, just like your mobile phone bill. So why should that itemization should also be effectively in IT, whether you're using a software application or infrastructure as a service? And then predominantly, around cloud services is really based around the whole internet technologies, because to me in cloud is kind of going from, you know, where we've been in terms of distributed systems, going back to almost centralized systems and really kind of back to the mainframe. The only difference being is the advent of technology around a chipset via Intel and AMD x86, allowing applications which are built on things like Linux and Microsoft being able to be accessed through a browser. So internet browser, whether it's IE, Firefox, or so forth. I like to refer to almost three common models around kind of cloud as we know today. And really the fundamental of that, the foundational aspect is the infrastructure as a service. It's that storage, it's that compute, it's the security, it's the network and that capability. Like the providers like Amazon and SunGard have infrastructure capability today. Or as you referred back to the last presentation from IBM, is that private cloud in the box with the pure flex systems. And then moving up towards platform as a service, that capability of almost developing that application using a common set of technology. So you could build one application using the same code set, allowing that to be built on one platform. So you can have multiple applications utilizing, you know, things like the infrastructure as a service. And moving up to that is obviously the software as a service application. You know, the darling of SaaS really is the likes of Salesforce and so forth. So kind of one for the audience. In terms of those three models, what I'd like to know if anybody actually has internally for a private cloud or utilized as a service provider, but if everybody could raise their hand if you use an infrastructure as a service or an infrastructure as a service today. Okay, okay. And then utilizing a platform as a service. Okay, so slightly less. What about software as a service? Okay, so obviously, you know, the popular one at the moment is obviously software as a service. Be interesting to look at the breakdown of that software as a service if people look at things like email as software as a service because I access, for example, Google Mail. Again, kind of looking at that breakdown is, you know, I'm surprised the majority of us had a Hotmail account 10 years ago. Was that cloud? That was just delivered across the internet. So again, I still think there's a level of confusion around cloud services because most of these cloud services are pretty much delivered across the internet. Does that necessarily mean it's a cloud? Unless they meet those 5 characteristics I went through. If we look at some of the usage types around cloud, kind of I've broken this down in terms of what it is and who, and kind of broken that down to 5 different elements. We've got that closed private cloud. Going back to the last presentation around the pure flex system, the rack, the cloud and the rack sitting in your own data center, effectively that could be a closed private cloud. And what we're seeing as an organization more recently as well in the last 6 to 12 months is the advent of the community cloud, especially around things like G-hosting or G-cloud, where the government has the initiative and has certified a number of providers like SunGard, IBM and others to be part of the G-cloud program. So this is almost like that, effectively a group of collaborating enterprises or government agencies. So, you know, for example, local councils, they're all looking to deliver a similar type of application. They're looking to have the same similar capability of an infrastructure as a service. So having those dynamics to bring forth the economic benefit from that, why don't you actually share a private cloud, a la community cloud? And then looking more towards the hosted private, hosted enterprise shared cloud, and then really around the commodity public cloud, you know, accessible across the internet, available to everybody, a la Amazon and Rackspace. And if we actually look at some of the type of customers against those different models, you know, you've got the Fortune 500. If I'd go and talk to you know, a large organization or a large banking institution like Barclays or Citibank, predominantly they will have their own private cloud sitting on their own floor. And in the banking industry, actually, from a cloud capability, the likes of Deutsche Bank, you know, 2-3 years ago, we already started to build cloud capabilities. The only aspect of that, and one of the slides I go through is, which we see from our customer requirement, is the hybrid capability. I still have those legacy systems. I still have a mainframe. I still have a, you know, a distributed system like an IBM AS400, which I still need to connect into to my capability to provide IT back to the business. So what about the drivers, goals, and markets? What have we seen in terms of what we see as the industry and what our customers are looking for around cloud and cloud capabilities? Obviously, looking at the left, key drivers and looking towards the key goals. You know, the key drivers being obviously the increased availability and performance. Whether that you do that internally or you do that externally through a service provider. Through the efficiency, through the orchestration tools, the automation, a level of self-service that cloud, especially around infrastructure as a service, can bring you, you should look at improved utilization for your applications and deliver higher application SLAs. Be able to deliver an application back to the business, you know, not taking 2 months. You should be able to spin that application up in a matter of days, if not hours. And one of the things around IBM, and I actually talk about one of their systems which they announced because I actually sitting on the launch for the Pure Flex system in London a month or so ago, is their Pure application system, which is actually using the notion of almost an enterprise iTunes store to be able to deliver an application back to the business in 4 hours, not 4 weeks, 4 hours. And through that automation, obviously you should be able to spend time on more strategic projects. You know, where are we going to go next as a business? How can we grow the business? Because at the moment, SunGard, like everybody else, is all about growth. We've gone through a turbulent time in terms of things like the recession. And actually, if we look at the recession itself, one of the big winners has actually been cloud, because of obviously moving away from that capital-heavy model to an operating expense model. So pay as you go, pay for what I need right now. And obviously the other element is the redundancy. Again, as I said, the move and the shift from you know, a CapEx heavy investment to OpEx, pay by the month. The other element we've seen, especially from our customer base, is where a customer doesn't necessarily want to grow their data center expansion. They've run out of power, they've run out of cooling capability, They don't suddenly want to just throw more money at effectively utilization of buying another 10 servers. You know, we actually had one customer come to us last October. There's a very large retail outlet, and they had a situation where they said, look, you know, for 12 months' time, our estate is fixed. However, when we come to December, we have 10 servers sitting out there, you know, and they are specifically for one need, to sell turkeys. So in December, loads of people get onto the website, start ordering turkeys for delivery. They have those 10 servers just sitting there doing nothing. So powered, cooled, software licensing, being maintained. They said, we don't actually need that, but we need that compute capability for that 1 month. Can you, SunGard, provide that compute capability in the notion of flex? And I need to utilize that compute power for that December when I need it. And that's one aspect of cloud and infrastructure service allows you to look at. If you have that flex or that almost seasonal period peak and demand. Looking at things like market dynamics in terms of adoption use cases, we actually do see a big drive around production hosting. But one of the things, especially from a SunGard perspective, if we look at kind of 10, 15 years ago when we were known pretty much for things like disaster recovery, and now if we look at SunGard as a business, you know, 60% of our business is now managed services. So, you know, for our own example, we've moved and made that paradigm shift from being a disaster recovery #1 provider to a managed services provider. But we always go back to things like the disaster recovery because actually where there is a level of nervousness around cloud, or I don't necessarily want to go straight into cloud. I have systems which are cloud capable and could move into cloud, but I still have some concerns, risks around things like security, compliance, the terms and conditions, the contracting. What about if I were to recover to cloud? If I could actually recover to a cloud system and prove that I could run my business in the event of a disaster, you're already kind of making that one small shift to going back to the business and going, look, I've used a cloud platform to actually recover to. Could I not use that now for production? Which goes on to availability. Obviously, the kind of clue in the title, SunGard Availability Services, that is something which is close to our heart. You know, people are looking at multi-availability zones. There's this notion around, especially around public cloud, of availability zones. Now, if you look at certain providers in the public cloud, especially in Europe, at the time, they have one data center. That is in Dublin, that is in Ireland. That goes, you lose your cloud, okay? I did trawl around the internet for some quotes and so forth. One interesting one, which I thought was brilliant, was Justin Timberlake, and it was his Twitter going around Rackspace. Obviously, he hosts his website on Rackspace. But I did actually thought that was quite funny around somebody like Justin Timberlake. You could question that, you know, any press is not necessarily bad press. But you do need to question your provider, whether you're using software as a service, infrastructure as a service, or the platform. What is their continuity plans? And also, especially around software as a service, because a lot of software as a service propositions do utilize potentially other people's infrastructure or other people's data centers. So ask the questions when you look to subscribe, depending on which level you are at, because obviously if you look at SMB, SME, if you're looking at potentially off-the-shelf SaaS proposition, that may not provide that flexibility of contract or necessarily the element to ask these type of questions. But have that in your mind to say, okay, I want to go for this SaaS proposition. How do you back up my data? And if I were to go to another SaaS proposition, how do I actually extract that data from you to the other provider? And I talk around data because that's one of the key things. Two key things to consider around cloud, and really what potentially won't push cloud further is the interoperability, the movement of large data, but also the network capability itself. However, do ask the questions, what is your backup? What is your continuity plans? What if something goes down? So when you look at that journey, don't just think of the here and now. Where will you be in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time? And where will that provider be? Are they financially stable? Talked around the hybrid as well. we actually see 90% of our customers still have that system sitting in the corner, doing 20, 30, 40% of their business. A system which necessarily could have been built 10 years ago. It's stable, it sits there, it provides me the results that I need back to my business in terms of IT. So how does that necessarily connect to a cloud system? And also, can you have that capability of having a single window to actually look at monitoring and management and the tickets and all the things which may go wrong in IT, the here and now? Do you have that capability through one window? And location is key, especially things like the G-Cloud initiative we're working with, and we're working with the likes of the NHS, with patient records. They actually have to stay within the UK, if not England itself. So again, if you have some compliance and regulatory aspects to your business, you also need to ask the questions, especially if you look at an external provider, where is the data held? And is it import or is it exported from country to country as well? So location is key. I actually did a round table, and somebody said up in the audience, they said, it's not cloud if you know where your data is. I thought that's crazy. Until we get to a point where the law of the world and the law of the EU and the law of North America changes, it is key to know where your data is in terms of location. So looking at some of the risks and looking at, if you were to outsource or you were to have some IT provision through a service provider, even if that's co-located at a data center or through an infrastructure as a service provider or a managed hosting company, would you actually look at cloud in any other different way than what you looked at maybe 5, 10 years ago? Because you need to consider things like, do you have change in market conditions? 5, 10 years ago, you would probably oversubscribe your IT, buy more than what you actually need. With cloud, it does change that economic discussion around moving from a capital-heavy investment to an OpEx investment, pay here and now for what you need. What about the unplanned scenarios around things like maybe a disaster, or an outage to the network? If you are looking at a public cloud provider, what is your connection out to the public cloud? Do you have resilient internet connections? What if that goes down? You're not going to be able to access those systems. They still might be up and running, but you're not going to be able to get your application. And what about the breach of security and policy controls? And also, if you are to look to a third party, what about things like denial of service, distributed denial of service? So where you may have a hack attack to a public-facing web application, where they might be selling a million hits to that web application, the chances are that could cause an outage as well. What protection around things like distributed denial of services as well? Like I said, I liken cloud risks to almost like old wine in new bottles. Does everything necessarily change from what you might have considered 5, 10 years ago to how you look at cloud today? You should look at the security as well. What about the compliance aspect as well, especially if you are a business which requires a compliant aspect around data and access to data? What about the connectivity I said? Does as well, if you were to look at an external cloud provider, does it have the capability of actually having private connections across a wide area network? Does it necessarily have to use the internet to access that cloud proposition? And how resilient is that? And one of my concerns as well, especially around the Advent Olympics, which I think is a great thing for the country and a great thing for London, but are we going to have our infrastructure, predominantly the internet infrastructure in this country as well, be able to stand up to the demand of everybody logging on, wanting to watch everything on YouTube or look at the highlights of BBC or any other provider which is doing the Olympics at that one time? Because it's all going to come into London as well. There's going to be a big test on our infrastructure. And that's one thing I think from a cloud perspective is, from a technological aspect around cloud and how cloud's delivered, I think is racing ahead at pace. The problem is our own internal infrastructure, whether it be in the UK or Europe or a worldwide basis, is still lagging behind. We still, 5 years ago, we were ahead on mobile networks. we have G3. We had G3 before most people, especially in the UK. I'll go to the US now, I can, log onto an iPad, I can have G4, 20 times faster mobile internet. We haven't got that now. We're lagging behind on that, and we're not going to get that until the end of this year. So again, there has to be some consideration around things like connectivity and the capability of our own infrastructure. Also, the manageability as well. Can I actually have real-time monitoring capability and a level of self-service? Now, a lot of you may not want true self-service, because one thing it concerns me, if I was a CIO, CTO, and had a number of system admins or developers having a company credit card and using the public cloud, and suddenly I get a bill which I've not considered for £5,000-10,000, because a lot of the public cloud providers charge you for the amount of time you read and write some storage onto the public cloud. It's not spinning up a VM, it's how many times you actually read or write that data as well. So there has to be consideration around that, especially around flex. Could you actually constrain that flex as well? And also have almost a capability around things like, what I call this managed workflow. Do I actually want everything to be self-service? Because I've got a tier 1 mission critical application here. If I'm going to look at a service provider to provide this capability for me, do we have the notion where I actually have managed workflow? I send a request. As long as it's completed within 2 hours, but it goes through relevant security, expert teams to actually make sure the change I'm going to make isn't going to affect all of my other applications. And also the availability. Could I potentially have dual site capability? What is the backup? Also, you've got my data. What if I have a failure? What if you lose my data? Also, if I go to another provider as well, how do I export that data? So, predictions. And I think it's quite hard necessarily to predict where this market's potentially going around cloud. But I definitely think there is a need for a multi-model, multi-vendor capability. Not everything in terms of what you have around your applications may fit one particular vendor. You may need multiple vendors. You may want to contain some of that yourself, but also have a level of interoperability to an external provider. And where the next thing in terms of the next year or two is that ability to burst and flex. So if I've got a private cloud sitting here, if I have that seasonal peak and I want to flex and have some more compute, and it's a tier 1 and tier 3 application, which isn't necessarily data heavy, could I go and use a public or a private cloud from a service provider to actually flex my application to, at that time of need? But I may have a use case for production, test dev, disaster recovery. The other thing as well is the next thing which the press are hyping is the whole big data thing as well, which I do have one slide on the big data. So I like to call it almost a holistic cloud model. When you look at kind of going back to the business, is almost plot the application against the necessarily need, and looking at one, do you have resilient networks? The other thing is around this whole advent of virtual desktop, hosted virtual desktop. Could I run my desktop in the cloud as well? Could I get rid of all these, the laptops and the desktops, and almost where the other thing is bring your own device to work as well, is that consumerization of IT. And looking at the cloud infrastructure as a service running those apps, but also cloud communications as well. Could I actually have the capability of almost having a virtual desktop with Recover Anywhere and actually have a soft phone sitting on that desktop and utilization of that cloud to make the communication at voice level as well? And kind of sitting outside that is that traditional hybrid IT, which I don't think, if you've built a system which is stable, you've built it in the last 5 years, which isn't necessarily cloud enabled, are you suddenly going to go and ditch that investment? Probably not. We have systems which, are going to still exist in the next 5 years, which aren't necessarily cloud enabled. So kind of trying to look at kind of providing some assistance and really looking at, if you were to look at the holistic cloud, is kind of look towards a cloud provider and kind of find a provider which will allow you into kind of almost the cloud platform with a service that is appropriate to your necessary usage, whether you sit the infrastructure service, platform, or software as a service. and look at the actual seamless transition between the two. So if I were to go and use a public cloud platform, to effectively do test and dev, because that's where, predominantly, 70, 80% of that usage case is currently in the public cloud. Once I've done my test and dev, if I actually want some of that test and dev data, how do I actually port some of that data back into a production cloud if it's not going to be with that said provider? And then looking at things like pre-production and production, managed production, unmanaged production, I still want to manage my operating system. I still want to manage some of my assets. I just want to use some infrastructure. And looking at kind of the production environment is, do you have a level of flexibility, for example, in the choice of SLAs against necessarily maybe the cost? So if I have a tier 3 application, do I really want a tier 1 cost against that application? So almost you had that element of 5, 10 years ago with the notion of tiered storage. So tiered storage being a quality and cost, a kind of a quality of performance of disk, which relates to a cost. So tier 0 is that solid state, very expensive disk. Tier 1 is almost fiber channel, tier 2 SATA, for example. Could you have that notion of tiered storage in tiered cloud as well? So you could plot the application and the cost back to your business effectively to the cost of that infrastructure provision. And again, look for the production of disaster recovery. I do see there is definitely a bridge coming towards of bridging that gap to kind of what I refer to as the consumerization. More so now, especially with people coming out of university, and college now, the Generation Y, as they call them, they want the Apple Mac, or they want the iPad, they want the iPhone or the Android. They use the things like iCloud, SkyDrive. There is definitely a bridge between the two. And how, going back to the business as well, do you potentially police that as well? So we've got pilots, for example, in our own organisation around bring your own device. Looking at the capability of bringing an iPad. But if I'm going to go and use things like Cloud On, which allows you to use PowerPoint and Excel on an iPad, or I use something like iCloud, there's some company corporate data potentially being able to be bridged the gap. So again, looking at things like data classification as well in cloud services is key to go back to the business to know what is able to be accessed across potentially the two different models, the commercial and the business. So really kind of as well is looking at things like having the capability of a single interface. If we're going to go and use multiple cloud providers, do I have the notion of providing that through one single interface as well? And do I have cloud cost analytics? So I call it almost cloud integration architecture. It's bringing those different necessarily clouds together, where it's private, public, service provider, or internal. How can I actually plot that to the CIO, CTO to show one single view of the real-time health usage of those cloud systems, but also have cost analytics? Why can't I actually have, for example, the application by the minute or application by the hour, which is costing my business? It's costing me £1, £2, whatever that might sit in terms of those different cloud models. So the death of infrastructure as a service as we know it, I really do think that space, regardless whether it's private or public, is going to be, or starting to be, a commoditized proposition. Okay? We will start to move towards a platform, and IBM spoke about it in the last presentation, is kind of making that significant move to platform as a service. The introduction of what I refer to in kind of that pure flex application, I said it on their launch day, is almost the advent of the enterprise iTunes. Amazon has announced application marketplace, which I'm not surprised, because they come from being a bookstore, a marketplace, which is kind of, to me, is the no-bid eBay. You pay for it now, moving into a cloud provider. So actually, everything they've learned over the last 5, 10 years, they're going to move into the cloud space. It's kind of moved by, kind of buy by the app. And then the new era of IT and cloud is the introduction of application-aware clouds. By putting different business process and metrics in that, and actually having applications move across those different tiers of cloud. Almost like the way we do data tiering and kind of storage tiering. I did plagiarise this slide from IBM because I got permission to from some people in IBM. But I actually think, why we were actually on the launch day as well, we see an opportunity as well for things like pure application, move into platform as a service, and almost move into that kind of buy the app. Is also kind of downloading those necessary patterns or that application code set and being able to sit on infrastructure as a service proposition and kind of dissolving away from buying by the VM or how much virtual CPU or how much memory. It should be, here's an app, here's my business process, this is the rules I want to put behind that application, and going back to the business, I should understand the cost, how quickly I can deploy that, how highly available is that, and so forth. And kind of finally is kind of the new kid on the block is big data. So again, I kind of think we've gone from the hype circle, it's all about cloud, and suddenly we now go to the press and even go to Heathrow Airport, Terminal 5, it's massive advert saying big data, which is a funny one, especially when I went with my girlfriend, which doesn't work in IT. I said, big data, what does that mean? So I try to explain it, but in theory, if we look at this, kind of big data are kind of data sets which are large and complex, which can't necessarily be worked with or is awkward to work with via traditional database tools. They've got the difficulties of things like capturing, storing, doing things like searching, storing, analysing, and kind of always visualising that data. If we look at big data, you are looking at things like petabytes, exabytes, and zettabytes, and almost going back to almost like high-performance computing, or actually some of this is data warehousing, where you do need a massive parallel scale of servers to go on, do that analysing, that searching. So you could almost say, is there a link between this and cloud? Kind of from the notion of cloud, especially around the public cloud, is huge amounts of servicing and being able to spin up, hundreds of thousands of VM instances. I don't necessarily think that big data is right for virtualization because of the amount of compute it needs to do that analytics. Is there a link between big data and cloud? Maybe, but you've got the whole notion again around data portability, especially when I look at things like zettabytes and exabytes of storage. I don't think, if I've got a cloud service sitting in Dublin or even Manchester or London and I'm down in Bournemouth, how, regardless of me having a gig line connection across the internet, for example, or a private connection from that provider to there, and I need to get that data out, there is no chance. That's going to take months. So I think there is the notion, the link is about the scale of compute power which can do their analytics. And in a recent comment from Mark Hurd of Oracle, used to be HP, he even said it, majority of big data is worthless. And this was a comment in the press for the 27th of April 2012. However, he did also lead on and say, the bulk of data isn't necessarily valuable to you, but there's something that is. So, for example, if you're a scientist and you're trying to work on a disease and you use the notion of big data, that 1% may be a cure for that disease. So there is a need for big data and the ability to do analytics. The other thing around things like crime and CCTV, I'll be interested to know how many CCTV cameras caught me, one sitting on 3 trains not moving and then trying to get here in time, running down the street. Probably looked like a bit of a criminal the way I was running anyway. But anyway, but how many times have I been caught camera? How many times have all you been caught camera today? And that 1%, that person which may be doing the wrongdoing, I see the need as well for big data as well. If we could capture elements which either cure people or indeed catch people which are doing wrong through the use of big data, that's a good thing. I still think there's a long way to do to actually go there. For example, one of the darlings on that kind of block with the new kid of big data is the likes of Hadoop. We've done some testing. We've actually got a technical preview where we're doing Hadoop as a service as well. But again, I think it's very much a niche thing. But there is a slight link to cloud. I just think there's a problem around things like data portability. Anyway, just last slide. Still think in 2015 or wherever we are in 2016, we're still going to have the same concerns. We're going to still talk around the same things. We're going to still talk around the security. We're still going to talk around the compliance. Law is not going to change, unless some things happen in Europe. First thing first with the euro, but maybe the EU. Anyway, not a political broadcast. Connectivity, manageability, and also the availability of my applications sitting on the cloud platform. Anyway, thank you for your time. That's me. I'm all done. Thank you.